welcome to Center A. My name is Tyler Russell, and I work here along with Natalie Tan. As many of you may know, Center A, the Vancouver International Center for Contemporary Asian Art, is dedicated to showing contemporary Asian art, both from here locally and abroad, and for facilitating conversations that contribute to our cultural development, both as an Asian city here in Vancouver, and as it pertains to various trans-Pacific conversations. And so today, it is a real honor to welcome this panel on photo-politics in the context of Jim Wong-Chu's exhibition, Jim Wong-Chu Photographs 1973 to 1981, People, Place, and Politics. Now, we do have to say that we're not exactly sure that 1973 is the start date for all the photos. Some of them could be from a bit earlier, but that's the timeline of the photography that you see around you. I guess I should say a little bit about, maybe say a bit about the exhibition. So this exhibition of photographs is a great opportunity for Center A as we move into Chinatown. Center A moved here to East Georgia Street last year, and we've begun to become a part of the community here. But how does that happen? How do you get to have a relationship with this place? During an earlier exhibition opening, Jim Wong-Chu happened to be around and was sharing different photographs and stories of his relationship to this community. Eventually, I was able to coax him to show me more of his photography. And he came by one day with Pender Street East, the portfolio, his graduation portfolio from when he went to what is now known as Emily Carr University. And it was an amazing collection of photographs from Chinatown in the 1970s. And exceptionally well taken, and printed with for the most part, printed with the full frame. So you'll see like a black outline, which is reflective of like that he's taking the full frame that he without uncropped images, and a lot of intimacy, you know, in the relationship with the people who are in the photographs. Also capturing like a texture of the community in that time, and some of the points that I noticed in the book seem to relate to the present day and seem to be really relevant to show to the community now. And one of the things that caught me in particular was one poem, and if you don't mind, I'll read it here. Election time, here we go again. Shake some hands, kiss a baby. Would a penny buy your thoughts? All's fair, you know, in the scramble for the elusive Chinese vote. And I thought, that's fantastic, and it's amazing how it connects with with this moment in time, because it still seems to be how things function. And so, anyhow, these photographs are here now, and I'm sure everybody will say a lot more about it during this time. And in the meantime, welcome here. Enjoy your stay. Like us on Facebook. I don't know, follow us on Twitter, those kinds of things. And welcome, first off, Chris Lee, who will introduce everybody else. Or begin that process of introducing person by person. Thanks.
Thanks, Tyler. So,
and congratulations on the...
I'll just say that. Okay, so I'm here because I'm the director of UBC's new Asian Canadian Asian Migration Studies program. We're launching this fall, and it's an undergraduate program for students who are interested in working with Asian Canadian communities in terms of culture, history, social development. And what we want to create for UBC students are actually, in some sense, opportunities to do projects like this. So if you think about the work you're doing right now at university, you can have an exhibit here in how many years since Jim made his undergraduate project. In other words, this is a program that really believes in empowering students to make knowledge about our communities and our histories. So we're really, really glad to be able to sponsor or co-sponsor work with Center A today to this panel. And also because it happens to be a perfect coincidence because Jim Wong-Chu has also been he is donating his papers of decades of cultural activism to the UBC library. And so as and we'll say a little bit more about that in a sec, but the work that Jim has been doing for decades in the community will now be available for researchers, for students, for visitors through the UBC library, and that's one of our really exciting projects as we launch what we're calling the ACAM program. So I have some cards. There's always something to take home. I can pass this around, or I can leave some more with Tyler, but especially if you're at UBC, please consider this program. I know some of you are in Henry's class right now. The learning that you're doing in his class is really indicative of what you could be doing across the curriculum, and we really want to make those opportunities available. So please, like us on Facebook, do all the Twitter kind of stuff as well. But visit our website, acam.arts.ubc.ca. Drop us a note and come by and see myself or Denise Fong, and we can tell you how to sign up for this program. So I can just pass this around. And my other task today is to actually introduce Alan Cho, who's a community engagement librarian at the Irving K. Barber Center. You guys all know where the Irving K. Barber Library is. Alan does community programming, and he's our other co-sponsor today. But he's going to say a little bit more about Jim Wong-Chu's collection and sort of what that means for the library and what that means for UBC and Asian Canadian Studies more broadly. So, Alan.
Thanks, Chris. My name is Alan Cho, and I am librarian from the University of British Columbia Library. So, Jim, on behalf of UBC Library, I'd like to really thank you for donating your archives to the library. I've known Jim for a number of years now, both professionally and personally as well. And I think over the years, he's talked so much about all the photographs, all the stories about Chinatown. He's about the same age as my father. So, as a fatherly figure, he gave me a lot of suggestions and a lot of stories all the time. And I would sort of brush him off and, say like, okay, that's great. I'm sure you took a lot of photos and you went through a lot of protests. But professionally, going through the archives is a very humbling experience. Just looking through the history, all the artifacts of basically Jim's collection is a history of Asian Canadian activism, Asian Canadian history, and also Asian American history as well. So today, my very quick presentation from a professional librarian standpoint is to showcase four main themes, I think, as a student, researcher, faculty member, or even community person who want to go into archives and study a particular period of history. You will find these four themes somewhat relevant. First one, I think, is certainly history and migration. Jim came here in the early 1950s, really at a time when he was the first wave, when it was very rare that someone would be coming from across the Pacific to Vancouver. So he was that first wave, but he also went back in 1957 because he was a paper son, and there was fear that he would be found. So this back and forth between the Pacific, I think the archives is if you look at the Jim Wong-Chu archives, you see this really interesting history, really fascinating history that is not necessarily in the textbooks. I think the second main theme is community activism. Jim has been through quite a bit through his time here in Vancouver, and he's witnessed quite a bit of the activism. So you see the records, the protests in Vancouver's Chinatown. I think that you'll see that. The Chinese Cultural Center, and of course his time in San Francisco, the protests at the I Hotel. And of course, the third main theme is literary community. I think, Jim, he's not only a photographer, he's also a poet and a writer. I think at one time or another, any Asian Canadian writer has gone through Jim, either through a discussion, sent in a manuscript. So you see all these manuscripts in there. A lot of them are unpublished, or they're basically first versions of a manuscript, like Madeleine Tien. She submitted her first manuscript, and it was turned down by publisher. And now she is known as one of the most famous Asian Canadian writers. So I think from that from a literary standpoint, Jim's archive is an invaluable resource to the researcher. And I think another key theme, I think, is certainly the growth of the artistic and cultural community in Vancouver. I think right now we're really blessed with some of the programs and some of the diverse ethnic programs that we have. But, Jim came from a time when it was the mainstream, that really dominated quite a bit of the artistic and cultural scene. I think Jim was the very first among the Asian Canadians to hold programs, things like that. I think his archives certainly show this. So there's a bit of the physical description of that. It's 9 boxes of materials, and I think it will continue to grow, more to come. And I'm not going to go into how to actually find the resources. I have some handouts at the back, so before you leave, feel free to take a look at that. But it's all available online for you to see the types of fonts that he has, the type of series of materials. It's really a microscope into the history of the past 50 years in Vancouver and certainly Asian Canadian history. So I'd like to thank Jim on behalf of the library and on behalf of UBC in donating your treasure trove of materials to the library. So thank you, Jim.
So my last task is to introduce the moderator for the panel discussion this afternoon on photo-politics and photo-poetics. Glenn Deere is both a teacher of mine as well, and now a very trusted and valued colleague of mine in the Department of English. Glenn really taught Asian Canadian literature when no one had any idea what that was. He taught the first class in Asian Canadian literature at UBC. His work has been absolutely central to establishing this field. He's edited special issues, magazines, on Asian Canadian culture, and his current work is on photography and poetry, which brings us to the work of Jim Wong-Chu, but also other writers and poets such as Roy Miki, Fred Waugh, and Roy Kyoka. So we're really, really lucky this afternoon that Glenn has agreed to curate this panel conversation, and so I'm just going to deliver the entire event to Glenn. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I'm just absolutely thrilled to be here at Center A. And I'm actually going to begin by acknowledging that we stand here on unceded Musqueam territory, and that I am grateful to the Musqueam First Nations for their ethical generosity over millennia in their stewardship over the land and providing an example of sustainability, and also aware then of our responsibilities in reaching out to communities and doing important progressive work. When I think about my fellow panelists here, I am feeling just so privileged and honored. First of all, Jim's photographs here are the reason for our gathering. And I've known Jim now for, must be over 16 years. I actually had a chance to visit the special collections yesterday and began looking at just one of the files, and it's a very moving experience to look at that history. I also recall a communication with Jim over a month ago with regard to this exhibit and a possible talk, and Jim he said to me, well, it's been many years since I've thought really deeply about these photographs, and I'm sort of like, well, he said in a very modest way, he said that that was a period, and I've kind of moved beyond the photographic, and I'm not really into photography these days. And then what happens just in the last couple of days at 3 a.m. in the morning, I get all these photographs sent to me by Jim Wong-Chu of the latest photographs from LiterAsian. So even though he's very sort of self-effacing and modest about the way in which he takes photographs and documents, he's always been a tireless promoter of Asian Canadian writing in securing grants for other writers, in holding workshops. I remember actually being invited to participate as a jury member for one of the Asian Canadian Emerging Writers Awards, and it was actually the year that the award went to Madeleine Thien. And I certainly valued the time that I had spent working with the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop and with Jim over many years. Jim, as you know, has been this tireless promoter and activist, a photographer, an editor of many anthologies, and someone who has reached out to the community in very important and informative ways. So I'm just delighted that we can have the panel in this space surrounded by this important body of work. But also on this panel, I'm just delighted as well that I have my colleague and friend and my great friend Jack Jardine as well, and I'll introduce the other panelists. Jack Jardine is a film producer and social activist who works with Vancouver's Smart Change as the executive director. And he has been involved also as a social worker. He's worked internationally in Australia, also in the UK, in London and in Manchester, working with refugee communities. He's worked with local communities here in the heart of the city. He worked with some of the people at Pigeons Park. Currently, he is working on making progressive social activist documentary films, and he's working with a variety of different political groups. Shelley Rosenblum is the curator of academic programs at the Belkin Art Gallery at the University of British Columbia. For, I think, at least 5 years, she has been doing this very important educational outreach work and has been coordinating a very important series of seminars. Actually, I have the privilege this year of being able to be a member of the seminar, and it's been a wonderful educational and networking experience to work with Shelley. So the panelists that we have here together, I can think of no other sort of ideal group of people to have a great conversation about the intersections and the relationships between photography, video work, visual culture, and communities. So I'm going to begin by asking the panelists about their relationship to communities and how the visual media in which they work, whether it's photography or whether it's video production or whether it's visual culture education, how their uses of these visual materials has transformed their social relationships with different communities, or how this has enabled a particular kind of social relationship with different communities. So we're going to then think through this aspect of the community photographic visual connection. And I'm actually going to start with Jim and have Jim just reflect then on how Jim's uses then of photography has enabled and transformed, in your case, your relationships with the communities that you've been involved in.
Well, I think for me, the last couple of months when I was organizing this exhibition was when I had some serious reflections on how these photographs and the meanings of how the photographs connect to a lot of what I'm doing in present day. And I think for me, this whole documenting of the community, which started off with just going to art school, and it seems like the only thing I seemed to be good at was photography, because in photography it's like cooking. We come from Chinese cafe experience, and cooking was you had to kind of do you have to develop negatives, and then you have to print the you have to make sure that the photograph that you're printing had the have the right perfect whites and so on. So you need an eye, and it's like cooking. So I seem to have found something good, but also by my coming down to Chinatown in the middle 60s, and like many of our younger guys at that time, Paul Yee, Sky Lee, and Sean Gunn, and many of the so-called young people at that time, we came down individually to look for our identity. And I come from a smaller town, and for me, the experience of being in a small town where you sometimes don't fit in, and you're being reminded constantly that you don't belong, and so on. So when I finally came down to Chinatown, I decided I better figure out what this was all about. And as I came down to Chinatown, I gravitated down to Chinatown. I realized that Chinatown was a place that accepted me. It was a place that we didn't have to judge each other, or it was just a place I felt very comfortable in. And when I went to art school, photography seemed to coincide, and I was influenced at that time by many of the documentary photographers of that era, Walker Evans and Diane Arbus, and many of those that made some incredibly haunting images of the kind of people that they connected to. So, and these photographs, thinking back, is that these photographs was more of an awakening for me. I was at a very early time when I was just formulating my ideas, trying to figure out who I am, what I am, and all that kind of stuff. And in the midst of all this, there were so many very important social events and activities that was coming in through the community. And I think that's a big part of where a lot of my personal experiences, and later on where I'd taken these images and experiences, and after I've completed the photography and moved on, I started to write. And it was in the writing and documenting the writing, and then the group of us that began to create the books of history, and then creating the ACAM Writers Workshop, the activism that followed, with the Writers Workshop, the fact that we needed to create a fiction and a body of literature. All those things kind of came into being, and as I kept going, you become more and more driven to the idea that we need to complete a mission. And the mission was to create culture, an Asian Canadian culture that at that time when we were around was not there. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay. You have spoken about how you did not want to turn then these relationships into just a spectacle, that everybody who was photographed received a copy of that photograph. There was a relationship there that was very important then, too, as well.
Yeah, I think the documentary photography to me gave me, you have to look at it this way. Anybody can take a picture. It's what makes you a photographer. Anybody can write. What makes you a writer? You have to justify yourself. You have to come up with a way to figure out what makes you so different, why you feel that you have the honor to be able to even call yourself a photographer. And for me, my concept is that I don't own the pictures. The people that are in the pictures own the pictures. I just simply is the person who took the picture. So I needed to know these people, and I made sure that at least, on every occasion I can, I make sure that the picture gets back to the person in the picture. And for me, in Chinatown was quite exotic in those days. Even in the 60s and onwards, there was just incredible neon. Tour buses would come in the nighttime just to travel down and to see the amount of neon. And this was like a tourist mecca. And people will come on with a camera and just snap a photograph. And some way, I felt that you're in some way, you're taking back a memory and so on. But for me, I can't do that. It's like stealing. And I had to make sure I had permission. I had to make sure that they're willing to let me take these pictures. And it actually took me 2 years of hanging around with a camera on the side and so on for people to finally accept me enough to feel comfortable enough to allow me to take the pictures.
Right. This question then of access to different communities is a question then I want to then put to Jack, because Jack has been involved as a film producer who has then addressed different types of community groups and has also then used his skills as a community organizer, as a group organizer, and also as a social worker to create bridges and open up dialogue. So your reflections then on the ways in which video production or use of visual materials changes or transforms your social relationships to those people in the community.
On Thursday night, the Metro Vancouver Alliance, which is the largest civic organization in the Lower Mainland, they had their 1,000 people out to present their platform to Gregor Robertson, Adrian Carr, and Mina Wong, and the NPA guy, which I can't remember. They had all the cameras going to get the big shots, and the film crews were getting the politicians. And my job was to shoot the assembly. And so the last couple days after that, what I've been doing is delivering bits and pieces back to the MVA. One of the things that I shot was the welcome of this assembly to Cardiff, who's trying to do the same thing. So really cool. Second message to another culture in another country trying to have a grassroots assembly. And then Edmonton's trying to have this citizens assembly form, and they're struggling. And so the footage that I shot, I put together fairly quickly, but it's so that the people here who are taking it to Edmonton can describe to them what the outcome is if they're successful. And so I joined the MVA specifically to be allowed to start telling stories about people who build movements. And much like Jim, I believe that you have to be inside. As soon as I saw his photos, I went, this is an inside guy. Every one of these people know him. You can tell it in their faces. And so that's the kind of thing I believe is really important, is authentic, real people. And they all look gorgeous, too. That's the other thing I really like. Everybody looks good. And I have a real commitment to that, that people are shown with honor and with beauty and integrity. And I also make sure everybody gets their own version of it. So, yeah.
Your comment on the inside position then, the importance of creating a connection with community. Also, in my mind, it resonates with something that I read about Jim's photos. Now, I'm glad to see that there's been coverage of this event, but there was a very quick comparison of Jim's photos to the photos of Fred Herzog, for example. And I thought, well, Fred Herzog's has received a lot of attention, but there are so many differences between Jim's work and Fred Herzog's. Not only is Jim shooting in this black and white format, but Jim has a very special relationship with all the people in the community. And Herzog's photographs, aside from their various virtues, do not actually track that particular community relationship, do not show a person who's inside an activist movement in that fashion at all. So you are also, you're working from the inside, working with groups who are involved in progressive political action. And you are also then needing to receive consent from them as you build trust. So how has that process then developed for you, especially when you're working with cameras and working with video and recording people?
My first videoing in Vancouver, I shot the Pigeon Park Street Market, and I did that with my iPhone. And I arranged with an Israeli company to stream my shots live to Facebook. And that was incredible. So here I was in the poorest market in Vancouver, having an upload through Israel onto Facebook. So people over time would know, okay, I can go to Jack's site and see real footage, live footage inside the market. Technology is allowing us to do stuff we could never do before. And that kind of immediacy, I think, is fantastic. So the goal, part of the MVA was really important to me. And being in the street and dealing with people is, when you're telling people stories, they feel empowered and they start talking. And when they see that you're honoring that, and other people see that you're honoring that, they start to line up. And before long, you've got the basis of a movement. So storytelling through the written word, through taping, through audio, visual media, it's almost the fastest way to get people activated to do something.
At this point, I'm going to bring Shelley into our conversation here and just ask Shelley then to reflect on the ways in which visual culture, as an art educator and as a curator, how the special aspects then of working with the visual and the photographic have in some ways nuanced your relationship to communities.
I wonder if I can start by just following up on a
Sure.
thread
Yeah.
that's been established here, starting with Tyler's introduction, and there's been a refrain about the immediacy and the intimacy of these photographs, and recognizing these as coming from the inside and not from the outside. And Jim, you started by talking about inspiration from documentary photographers whose work you appreciate, and use the word haunting. I've been spending a lot of time, as you know, and together in conversation, thinking these past few months about this question of what constitutes documentary photography and why does this matter. And I hear a language of ethics coming up in this discussion, which I think is critical to the question of community and the cultural work of this body of work. Every photograph is a document in some way, and yet we have to ask, what is a documentary photograph separate from any other photograph that documents? The history of documentary photography is very loaded with its political, social moments. So I think of the Farm Security Administration and how we think of documentary photography. I do, certainly primarily in relationship to the Depression. And you mentioned Walker Evans, and the practice of this documentation is not about news or just a record, but to be in the service of a larger social, educational, ethical impulse. And what makes a photograph documentary and not just a document is that desire and an incentive and impulse to have it resonate in that way. And I'm deeply struck by that aspect of these photographs and how this work is such an important part of our ongoing effort to understand Vancouver and where we've come from and what we are and how we might think very seriously about where we're going given these histories. So I find myself, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of documentary, but when you invoke Fred Herzog in that bizarre remark in the Vancouver Sun piece, which maybe we'll talk about more later, there's a real difference between documentary photography and street photography. And I'm really compelled by the way street photography, every photograph arrests a moment in time and creates this memory and freezes the moment, but the street photograph is about, seems to me, getting at some arrested moment of realness in the everyday. And it's that quotidian aspect of everyday lived experience which really calls out to me in this body of work. Street photography, I think, is also different in many ways from documentary photography because this work is so much about the poetry of that moment, the poetics of capturing an everyday lived experience, which takes me back to that thread of a discussion around intimacy and immediacy. So even though there's this incredible humility in these photographs about them not being about the photographer, I don't see the shadow of the photographer in any of these images. For instance, I don't feel the photographer in that way, but I certainly do in that intimacy, and that can only be established by a lived relationship. Otherwise, we wouldn't feel like we were inside of this relationship in a specific moment between specific subjects and actors, and not in an abstracted outside way. And that seems to me incredible work in terms of a community and a social project.
Shelley, given your very precise analytic eye then, in looking at some of these photographs created by Jim, we have then those that are immersed in collective movement. They are on the street, they are public photos. And then we have those photos that we would say to be portrait photos, showing often merchant store owners, people in their quotidian, everyday workplace settings. What would we say then about what this is presenting to us as a story then about the different aspects of life? Is there something that is being said here to us, or do we read it this way in terms of public versus the thresholds of the public world and into a kind of domestic space?
That's really interesting, and I think I'd add to that general discussion about street photography is that it's something that happens in a public space, but it's about the most private things, and that paradox is what's really brought out here, and that relationship between a street scene and what's in public, but a portrait, the way that kind of fleshes out a story of how everyday lived experience happens. That tension is really productive in this exhibition. I think I can't help, many of you may know we have an Ai Weiwei exhibition at the Belkin right now, photographs of the decade that Ai Weiwei was in New York, 1983 to 93, and we had an interesting discussion today that Chris Lee was a part of, and part of the discussion went to, in what ways is that exhibition about New York, that photographer's experience in New York personally at that moment, is much a story about Vancouver in some ways when we come in to see that, and the discussion around comings and goings and cultural context back and forth, that this isn't a one-directional thing, this kind of contacts. And I see this dialogically with that show because of the ways in which they both can be in a conversation about Vancouver. I also find myself thinking about this show in relation to something I found by chance, in fact, poking out of a dumpster the other day, which is an amazing publication by the Aquarium. I didn't know they used to publish journals. I don't know if anyone's seen them, and this is about streams in Vancouver. I haven't seen any of them because they're not daylighted anymore, and there's, as we know, a big movement to try to bring these streams back. But in this issue about streams are photographs of them historically, so neighborhoods at the turn of the century. And you started by by acknowledging the unceded territory, Musqueam territory, and the kind of ethical paradigm that forces us to confront when we reflect on that, not just remark on it in a rote way that sometimes happens when we begin every event at UBC. And looking at these everyday street scenes, which are very different in 1904 on Waterloo near Kitts Beach and here, they still really force us to confront what I feel is this impulse in Vancouver, a very presentist impulse that obscures history and asks us constantly to think of ourselves as living in the most livable city in some simulacrum that's like Copenhagen or Amsterdam or Hong Kong, and how are we like all these other cities in a way that would want us to make this place generic and not grounded and not specific. And these bodies of photographs that try to document but also have an ethical impulse, and the kind of work that they do force us to ground ourselves in our very specific realities of this place. These photographs force us to do that. I think.
This is a really beautiful way, I think, then, of using this idea of the hidden layers of history and how I think the photographs are as much about what will be absent or what is absent as much as they are documents of what seems to be visually present. And I think the historical recovery then that these photographs prompt is crucial. And I know, Jim's thinking, I think, all along has been that of an historian, a preserver, someone who is very ethically concerned with memory. And so certainly these photographs, they enact particular kinds of critical memories. I'm wondering about how then these photographs in your own photographic practice over this period of time, how it was beginning to shape your sense of what could be remembered or what you wanted to remember. And certainly you have, over the years, you've also worked as an historian, doing the essential work of mobilizing histories that had been previously marginalized. So I'm trying to think of pathways from this kind of photographic historical work and then also your larger historical work on Chinese Canadian community, on Asian Canada, and so on, how that informs your work as an historian.
That's a very interesting question because at one time, after spending a few years in Hong Kong, I learned Cantonese. I came back, and for the next 10 years, I didn't really have an opportunity to speak it. And essentially, after 10 years, I lost the ability to articulate in Chinese. And I really felt a crisis. And what I did was that I went down to the YWCA, the Chinese community pulled money together and created a little social service office. They call it the YWCA. It has a gymnasium and also some offices there. And I, in order to practice my Chinese, I helped fill forms for these old-timers. And so it was sort of like a Chinglish. Every word I knew in Chinese I speak, and every word didn't I use English. And then slowly I kept replacing until I became fluent. But the consequence of that was that a lot of these old-timers, most of them were bachelors. They really didn't have a chance to talk to anybody. And here I was just a willing target. And so they just poured out all this pain and sorrow and isolation, all their own personal history to me. And in some ways, it was almost like an assault because, it was so graphically, like it was a very hard kind of thing to realize that these people were telling me stories but yet in some ways, what it made me realize that, because up to that point, I thought I was the one that was having a hard time. I was the one that was having a lot of self-pity. Why me? Why am I here? And why am I, why do I feel this way? And so on. But then I realized for the first time that, no, it's not just us. There's a whole collective experience. All these other people were going through the same thing. And that's when I realized that there's something much larger. And that's where I began my pathway into history. I needed to know. I needed to understand. I needed to know why. And the more I understood, the more angry I became. Because we were very, very badly treated. People didn't want us here. People wanted us dead. People that were here eked out a living with no family. And really just live out a life in total isolation. It was pretty sad. But I think that compelled me into history. And the thing that I think was quite interesting is that, people say that, knowledge sets you free. It's not true. Knowledge actually enslaves you. Because once you know, then you have to do something about it. You either that or you become an accomplice and sit aside and not do anything. And once I knew these things had happened, and as a historian, there's always this concept and idea that we can possibly, because we understand, we can bend the history. we can change the direction of it, we can make things better, or at least we'll make things that were not there. So, I mean, when I was young, sitting down in Hong Kong Cafe or BC Royal with Paul and Sky and all these people, we keep asking questions, what if? And then, of course, the consequence, why not? And then, and then I understand now, Canada is a very unique place. They allow you to say anything you want. They allow you to do anything you want. But nobody does it for you. So if you want it to happen, you do it yourself. And if nobody was doing it, then I had to do it. So I think the whole historical activism, the idea that I had to understand the history, then from understanding history, I can see where it will repeat. And if I didn't like the reality of that, then I have to create a new reality. And so the visual component of this is something that, because I've gone away from it, I've gone into writing, because I didn't think that we had enough literature. We had to, even we didn't have enough history, enough personal stories that some people in fiction have to make it up. They have to add to it to make it whole. But then I realize now, after these photographs are done, that without the visual context, the words wouldn't be the same, because you can read it. You cannot understand until you actually see a photograph of what was going on now in that past, in that period. It doesn't hit home. So now I understand the context with visual image and the text and that's why in this photo exhibition there's a lot of text, because without the context it doesn't work. The other thing I think that was very important, and I was lucky that Tyler wanted me to exhibit here, because context was important. This exhibition would never ever be outside Chinatown. I would never exhibit this outside Chinatown. If anybody asked me, I would say no. It had to be located in this community. It had to be seen by this community. And the people here had to connect to it. You can come in to see it, but it's for the community.
If you could reflect then on conversations that you've had as the exhibit has been ongoing, as people have sometimes recognized their earlier selves in these photographs, or said, oh, I remember, oh, I have that photograph, you gave me that photograph. So you've entered into dialogue with people then from the community who are actually present now. That's, I think, another difference in this kind of documentary project. It's an amazing, actually, aspect of your documentary project. But amongst then the different conversations that you've had with people here, then can you just begin to point to some of the things that you found to be really quite compelling, or there were people who approached you and said, do you remember what happened when we took that photograph? How has this exhibit itself then spurred on a dialogue that you hadn't perhaps even anticipated?
Well, I knew most of these people, some of them by first name, some of them were personal friends. But after 30 years, I forgot quite a few of the names, and I was really quite concerned about that. And so we tried to make sure that the people come, if they can recognize somebody, to point them out and so on. So quite a few of these images, people actually come and say, I know who this person is. And I think what has been really amazing is that the people that have come that supplemented the stories, the supplement memories that are not even here that I have. There's a woman named Sylvia Mahal, and she's South Asian. And she came in here and he said, the Club New Delhi, it was on Main Street. Chinatown and Main Street in the 70s was full of nightclubs. There was a Kubla Khan, there was the Shanghai Junk, Elegant Parlor, Tommy Chong, Cheatin' Chong, he was playing here. There was the supper clubs, the Smiling Buddha and Marco Polo. It was full of this really rich nightlife. And Sylvia said, my father started the Club New Delhi. And I didn't realize that, because this Club New Delhi, obviously, that, it would be started by South Asian. So she knows the whole community of these people that were still around that actually were a big part of that whole nightclub experience. And so I am just so ecstatic because I'm getting together, having coffee with her, and there's a whole a new area that I need to explore, and they have photographs and so on. So, I mean, things like that to me is just amazing, you know, that I can invoke that kind of memory and experience. Another person that came to me, you know, because we're talking about the ping pong, you know, the picture there about the ping pong championship that Peter Joe won. And Peter Joe and his father there are the people that started Sunrise soy milk, which is now a huge company. But, you know, in his teens, he was the ping pong champion. But this guy said, you know, we had a basketball league that was huge. You know, teams, there were stores that would sponsor teams. There were huge rivalries. People were gambling on the side, making side bets and so on. It was a huge thing. And he said, I got photographs. So,
I'd love to hear you tell stories.
Oh, yeah. I know. I'm a storyteller. That's all I've become now, you know. Because most of the time I was writing grants for all those years. I only wrote one book of poetry. And since that time, I didn't, and it was part of that impetus, because after I wrote that book of poetry, I realized that I was the first one, that nobody wrote a book in English about Chinatowns, you know, before, and then you realize that's 150 years since we've been here, and I'm the first one. And I think that that was what Paul E. Skyley, myself, and those in the early ages, that we felt that we had to do something about. So, you know, we're part of that whole process, right? And, you know, it's all this kind of awareness that, but, I mean, this is just a slice of Chinatown. There's so many levels of Chinatown that I haven't even gotten to. And so little of it has been documented, and we need to recover it, because especially in the present day, Chinatown is changing. But if there's no history, there's no context around where this new community is built, then this, you know, it'll be diminished, much more diminished.
I'm really struck by what you just said about how then people have offered more photographs that they can then pull out of their personal collections or their archives. They then lend you stories, or their stories arise out of seeing your exhibit here, and they then are continuing the narrative. But then they're also pulling out their own photographs as well too. While we're on the subject of dialogue, I'm going to bring Jack back into the dialogue just then to reflect then again on how your work has led to dialogues around social progress and the intersections of the visual and the kinds of continuing and perhaps even surprising dialogues that you've had that were unanticipated in your work.
Well, just before I do that, when I was in East London, where I lived, I went into a studio and I had a real eye-opening, because I was shooting pictures of buildings and street photography of people. And I saw this exhibit of when East London was Jewish. And this guy took just ordinary photos of Jewish people in the bakery, or they were tailors, kids in the street. And if you just looked at it in that hour, it's an okay photograph. 40 years later, it's an amazing photograph. And that's what these are really like. Time puts a patina, puts a meaning onto a photograph, if it's a real photograph. And so I started shooting with trying to talk to people in the future about what I was shooting right now. Completely changed the way I did my work. So the dialogue, you get challenged a lot if you have a camera and you're in some place and something's happening. And I was asked by one faction in the downtown east side to be inside their coup when they were taking over the downtown east side. I forget the name of it. It's the local organization down. And so they were mounting a coup. And they had got all their grouped together, and I was filming this, and the old guard were tolerating that while the dynamics were in play. And then the coup happened, and I got really severely challenged. People were grabbing my camera, they were grabbing my tripod, they were yelling out that I was an interloper, though I'd been a big sign on the front saying this is a public gathering and there will be cameras. So, not a dialogue. There's definitely a very intense conversation going on about what right did I have to be there, and on what was the handshake? What was I going to do with the stuff that I'd collected? And so that's that. I ended up just grabbing my stuff and getting the hell out of there because it seemed like the right thing to do. So now I'm in Oppenheimer Park, and I'm trying to establish a relationship with the people there while they're doing the occupation. And some of the denizens of the losing side that were trying to grab my stuff a year previous pop out of the woodwork. And it's all going to happen again. And so this time, though, I was a little bit better known. There were more people who kind of said, look, you can't behave that way towards this guy. He's not doing anything. And I also had a chance to talk with them about how that day happened. So, and I live down here. I just live across the street from the Stadium Chinatown station. So I have a vested interest in not upsetting people because I want to be able to do what I do and not be harassed or feel like I'm harassing people. Then I was on Commercial Drive, and we're shooting a youth vote video. And we just showed up, and we start doing our thing. And the local guys, they start off just watching, but after a while, there's a swirl of activity around these interlopers on their park. And it's getting closer and closer, and they're starting to, photobomb and all sorts of stuff like that. And then Scott Clark shows up. And I know Scott Clark really well. It stops instantly. We have nothing but peace and quiet for the next 2 hours. So the knowing people, having real relationships, makes things easier, makes things safer for everybody. So relationships really important, and talking and knowing where you are and who you're with is vital.
I also wanted to acknowledge that this is a videoed public event. We have cameras here, obviously. But I wanted actually to come back to Shelley and just pick up on the idea of the future and thinking about, Jack's anticipation when he takes photographs, he's thinking about how this might look then to viewers then in the future. And just to think about our sense of the future, since we've gone through history and memory, and the way in which we anticipate the work that we will do will be seen later. And that sense of a kind of futurology, kind of a future conscious type of approach to curating, to the way in which we teach the visual, and the way in which we make outreaches to the community as well. Our sense of futures and our future-oriented sense of what we do.
Well, I think there's some sense in which we're very good at erasure in Vancouver, generally, and I think that's something that's coming up in oblique ways on the precipice of an election, and we talk about erasure certainly in terms of development in the city, and the very active reimagining of our built environment by violent means of destruction to build anew and to build anew. And I think really as someone who's an immigrant to this city and to this country, these kinds of projects of mining for history allow us all to have, I think, a real purchase and a sense of place, and a place that's very good at not always wanting to have that sense of place. And I think that's critical. So, your remarks about this has to be in Chinatown resonate so strongly for me, but they have to be in Chinatown too for a larger Vancouver community to come here to the neighborhood to see this. So this interpolates all sorts of communities that we might otherwise see as separate that I think are not and have to be and are addressed by your work. And that seems very, very important to me. And the Balkan really spends a lot of time thinking about things Vancouver, things Canadian, but particularly things Vancouver from this moment, from the 60s and 70s, a kind of avant-garde on, in order, I think, not just as a fetishizing what we were, but understanding a kind of evolution and process of futurity that addresses all sorts of communities. And I think the discussion that we haven't been able to have enough today about the relationship between text and context and how we read a photograph, but we also read the written word, the way these come together, there's a larger Vancouver discussion around not separating out a photographic practice and a painterly practice and a ceramic practice and a writerly practice. And this kind of need that you articulated to do these things in tandem and multiply really speak to that project, I think.
Right. I think that's very important to highlight, especially Jim's his insistence that this be exhibited in Chinatown, but also that Jim's insistence that this be curated with the contextual inscriptions that we have here on the walls that provide that important sense of history. That these photographs do not begin to speak clearly to that history without the written explanations that we have here, but also it was Jim's decision as well to mount this alongside the poetry. And of course, we have the title for this panel is Photo-Politics, Visualizing Social Transformation, but is also, the long title is Photo-Poetics. And Photo-Poetics, Photo-Politics, Visualizing Social Transformation, that we mustn't forget that there is this alternative way of speaking, a way that pushes against our conventional discourses. And that's what the poetic voice, I think, Jim seems to bring to this. And I just wanted to give actually Jim on this panel, before we open it up to questions and discussion from our audience here, just to have Jim reflect then on Jim's selection of the poetry and the importance of having the poetry here in a kind of conversation then with the visual the visual artifacts that you have here as well.
Well, I think the word that comes to me is memory. I think the reason why I got out of photography was that I was so dissatisfied with the idea that I knew so much about some of the people in these images. I knew the stories, I had stories around them that I couldn't articulate at that time in my life. And so that's why I kind of moved away from it, because I had to search for the way to articulate that. But after, but also that was at a period where black and white photography was at its ebb. Mm-hmm. So there was a gap, and I never found a way to get back to it. Mm. And it's a sad way, but it's also a memory. But I think I want to bring it to the present, because I see a lot of young artists, especially a lot of Asian Canadian artists that are in the community. And memory is something that is a problem, because when we came into the community in the 60s and 70s, we were looking for our identity. And I find much in the work of many of these young artists is that they're still dealing with identity. But the thing is that they don't have the memory. And nobody has actually archived all the past exhibitions, all the great artists and all the directions and the thoughts of some of these people. So these people have nothing to start, so they start right from square one over again. They don't have the tradition, the history, and the memory to be able to actually learn from, or to set a reference point and say, okay, this has been done now. We should be doing more towards in march of the direction. A very good example of memory is that in Chinatown, it's full of restaurants. In fact, in the early days, every second or third establishment was a cafe or restaurant. You come down Chinatown to eat. And now finally, Fu Soho, the last one of the old Chinatown restaurants, is closing on October 25th. And Joanne, who is relinquishing it now to somebody else, but will keep recipes and restaurants. But you see, for me, eating is the same thing. For me, it's memory. And it's eating memory. So when you taste the food, it resonates back to those times that you and your father, and when they got together for dinner and so on. People used to come down to Chinatown just to have dinners. And there's a non-Asians. They come down because this is where they take them to have their birthday dinner or things like that. There's this memory, collective memory, and many of these people come back looking for that memory and looking for the food that they connect to in the past. And I think that this is the kind of thing that I think is unique about the kind of work that I've gotten right now. In some way, it's relevant because there is a kind of a political action in this, in what we're doing. I mean, I didn't realize those days, but I was a radical because I'm always committed to change. And now I understand I'm still committed to change. And everything that I do in the community is to try to change and provide new direction and a new vision for where things are. But then I didn't realize, if you see these photographs, you get a sense of a working class Chinatown. This is all working class people. There's no elite people. We're not dressed up in the nines and so on. This is the common everyday people. This is how vibrant it was. In the 70s, in the weekends, you were very lucky to be able to walk on the sidewalk without actually having to get off the sidewalk into the street because it was 6 deep full of people. This is where everybody came to buy your groceries, to eat, to do your conveyance for your house and your mortgages and everything. Everything was here. And I think that was what's so unique. And at that time, if you could find a parking spot 4 blocks within 4-block radius, you're so lucky. You should buy a lottery ticket. So I think that's what it was. But when I finally had this set of photographs, because what happened was somebody helped me digitize these negatives. And it was after seeing them in its entirety that I realized the significance of the exhibition or what I needed for the exhibition. But the idea also was that although Chinatown was at its most vibrant and at the zenith at a time where everything was there, Chinatown was actually fighting for its very, very existence, its life, because I think, and I go back to a little bit of history to give you a little bit of a history lesson. And it's my kind of take on how things are. Because in 1907, there was a riot in Chinatown. Right next to Carnegie Center was the old City Hall. And the anti-Asia elite was agitating, and some people threw some rocks, and they just rampaged down Chinatown, broke all the windows, beat people up, and just destroyed everything they could. And then they turned around in the Abbott Street, turned around and came up Powell Street to do the same to Japantown. Although the Japanese had already got wind of it, they barricaded the street and they fought them off. Mm-hmm. That was a time when China was the sick man of Asia. It was the most humiliating day in the whole history of Chinatown. And it also was part of the reason why the 1911 revolution took on the Republic, why that came about. Because what happened was that, because in 1907 this happened, and in 1911, in a matter of 4 years, when the Sen came and started talking about a new republic, a new time, we'll gather, we can stand on our feet again, that many of these people were saving the money to go back to China and trying to build a little grub stake and live their life out there. They took the money and donated it all to Sen. To a point where there was not enough money. And the Chinese Freemason, who was the main sponsor, laid out an order to mortgage all their buildings and gave that money to Sen. So the 1911 revolution, the overseas Chinese community, and especially the Chinese people in Vancouver, had so much to do with it. So that was happening. But, you know, Japan at the same time was they were a naval power already. In 1905, they already destroyed the Russian Navy in the Pacific. So the Japanese consul here came and talked to these politicians and said, you better apologize, and you better start looking at giving us reparations, or else I'm going to send 2 of our warships into Vancouver Harbor. So, you see, I think the racist kind of crowd at that time that was trying to agitate always felt the Japanese got away with it. So during the Second World War, when they bombed Pearl Harbor, the racist element here saw the opportunity. So they not only evacuated, and literally just sweep them out of Japantown. They made sure they sold all the property. And because they sold all the property, the federal government, after the war, could not allow them to come back to the coast. In America, that's what they did. You know, the Americans allowed the Japanese to go back, reassume their lives, and so on. But in Canada, because they sold it off, and it was deliberately done in that way, that, you know, if they came back, they would sue for and try to recover and so on. So they said no. So that's why in Canada it was much, much more heavy-handed, and that the Japanese were only allowed to go back to Japan or east of the Rockies. Well, they did that. Well, in the 1950s, late 1950s, 60s, they started urban renewal here. And during that period, the city deliberately made sure that they did not clean up or maintain the services in this area, this whole area of Strathcona. And by so, they became more and more decrepit, and they became, quote-unquote, slum. The thing was that they wanted then to take all that property right in Strathcona all the way up to Clark Street and make that into low-income housing. This was going to be the projects that the Americans had. So you can imagine if that was all low-income housing and we had downtown East Side, this area would be the armpit of the city in the current day. But the way they did it was what I was talking about. They picked on the mostly, you know, this Strathcona community was mostly Chinese and a lot of working poor. But what they did was that, you see, in 1953, when I first came, and my uncle bought a house on Victoria and Broadway, he paid $18,000 for the house. Well, the city, for each one of these properties, including the house, they were only giving $6,000 to $8,000. Not enough for you to buy another place elsewhere. And that was the intent. They wanted to evacuate, remove you in that way, make you, punish you in that kind of way. So that was going on. At the same time, there was a freeway that they wanted to go down here. And it was going to take on Venables and Prior Street. It was going to be an 8-lane freeway. And that means that they would have to expropriate all the properties adjacent to it and to make that happen. And then it was supposed to come down and curve into what is right now the Cultural Center and the Chinatown Gardens. It would have cut Chinatown in half. And that's what they were doing. And it was only at that point where the Chinese many of the Chinese had lost their property through expropriation, that finally the community stood up and said no more. And because they stood up, and that's where you see the activism there, where these people were going on buses with placards, and these people were not, the articulate, the activists. They were actually just plain home folks that just had enough, and they marched into City Hall, and through the efforts, changed the whole political regime. Got the whole, the planner and ministers fired and stopped this whole process. But the reason why I say it's so, the racial element is there, was that during this fight, the federal government said, okay, the bridge for the third crossing and this whole area of the freeway, we're not going to commit to it anymore. We're not going to give you the $200 million. So the building of this part of the freeway was moot. It would go nowhere. They still persisted. They wanted to still put it through. And that's how diabolical it is. They wanted to punish Chinatown. And, and it was this kind of insistence. That's where you see the racist intent.
And that's where your photographs, of course, come in. And your photographs, which has also then given us this wonderful historical context, which you've then been able to revisit in this discussion too, also reminded me that in the work that you've done with the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop, Sky Lee's Disappearing Moon Cafe, of course, grew out of the group that you were organizing with, the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop, and that if you read the novel, and I've had students ask me, what is this address for Disappearing Moon Cafe? Where is it? And if you read the novel, you realize that it's actually where the Chinese Cultural Center is. That's where it is. And it's not disappearing, it's reappearing Chinese Canadian history in the form of Jim Wong-Chu in his photographs. I'd like to thank our panelists, but before we actually wrap up, I want to actually open up the discussion and warmly invite any questions or comments. Thank you for attending today. It looks like we have really a nice turnout this afternoon. So just invite any questions or comments from members of our audience. And I know that we have then many of you eager to participate. And in the front first, Henry. Henry Hughes, yes.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thanks, Jim, for your generosity. And I'm loud enough. But thanks, Jim, for your generosity in both doing this exhibit and also in donating all of your really important papers and all the things that you collected over the decades to UBC libraries so that students like the ones here from my class can work on them. The question I had was, you talked about the freeway threat. We talked about fights like, and also barbecue duck fight and things that you were involved with. It seems to me right now the two Kiefer and Maine condos and this proposal on on Kiefer and Columbia for a 137 sort of unit condominium complex. It does really strike me that why did we save Chinatown from the freeway if that's what Chinatown's future is going to be, a kind of faceless Yaletown glass towers look, and two of those buildings are already up. And so I guess I'm asking you to reflect on the history, but also this present moment when really all could be lost within a few years. And you look at your photographs and we see less and less of that. Half a block down is the Brixton, which I'm sure it's a lovely bar, but that's not what you've captured here. It's something else that's coming in. So I guess it's just to ask you all three of you really to reflect on what's the present moment in memory, you could say, of this earlier moment.
Thank you, Henry. Jim?
I'm a historian. I've reconciled with the idea of that Chinatown needs to change. I think we need to bend history. We don't need to accept the history. We don't accept that this is the direction everything has to flow. And we have to find solutions to allow for the retention of culture, maybe to a place where young artists and artistic groups can come back into the community and actually reflect the community in a much more imaginary but a much more articulate way. I think there still needs to be a lot of work done, but you have to ask. And I say in Canada, you have to do it yourself. Nobody's going to do it for you. So we have to articulate exactly what we need to make the community better. So I think that's part of it. The other thing that I reconcile with is that, let's face it, most of the Chinese who moved out, they don't want to move back in. That's the whole point why they moved out. It was a badge of honor to be able to live out and buy a better house and live outside there. A very good example is one West Pender there where Milton Wong bought the H.A. Simon building and rebuilt the whole thing. And his whole initial intention was to allow some of his family, his extended family, to go back into Chinatown live. No takers. I think that's the reality. And I think the thing about City Hall that was really bad was that it created this heritage designation. And it made it much more difficult to redevelop the community. The redevelopment should have happened 15, 20 years ago. And it would have been gradual and it would have done better. The other thing that you have to realize is that Chinatown in the early days, because it was isolated, you know, and you couldn't live outside there, that the Chinese are concentrated, it actually had its own economy. You know, it had restaurants and that serviced the local population, it had barbershops, and it had a mix of things that actually serve itself, and it has an economy. And I think what is now done is that there's no more economy, and maybe the only way that we're going to do it is to allow the development around it so that it can build enough economy so that the stores and so on, the services will be able to reflect the needs and to build a vibrant community that with an economy that serves itself. So I have no illusions about where the future is going to go. And this is already the pattern. If you see historically, the first groups that move in are usually the artists and the art galleries, cheap rent. You know, and when they make this, you know, the bohemians move in, and after a while, you know, they make this place funky, and then next thing you know, the developers get in and they get pushed out. You know, that's part of the gentrification process. We're in the process right now. So I think that I see that the way it's working. I wish that it would have been a more gradual process, because this is very abrupt. And I think for the community, and I went to a lot of these meetings for the communities, and the sad thing is that they talk about redevelopment and all that, and many of the Chinese that go there usually leave before the end of the presentation because they realize there's nothing that reflects themselves in there. There's no Chinese content, or there's no concern, no connection. And I think that that's where people like yourselves and so on, where we have to kind of revisualize what kind of community, what kind of place this is. Because without it, Vancouver is diminished. You can't just use Richmond, Chinatown as Chinatown. This is, you know, ground zero. This is where the history, this is where everything came from. This is the wellspring. So in some way, it's incumbent on us to try to redocument it, to make it come alive in our own minds and so on.
Jim, I'm just going to cut in as exercise my moderator's prerogative, but I remember there was a time in the 60s when Jim used to get one of those big muscle cars, as he described them, and drive them at 100 miles per hour, not 100 kilometers an hour, but drive to San Francisco for 12 hours because you wanted to be involved in all the great life there, but also to connect with San Francisco's Chinatown as well, which today remains very vibrant. Also, we have to think about, you know, what's happening locally, that here in Vancouver we can also not have the kind of zoning and the kind of pragmatic work that's done to protect particular scales of livability and economy too. But I just wanted to just jump in there with a comment, just comparing us to, because everybody compares us to San Francisco, but if you look at what's happening to their, you know, preservation and that sense of local and history, very different than ours. But anyone else want to jump in at this point, or should I open it up again to the floor?
No, I'll just say that's what I was referencing with our excellence at erasure.
Our excellence at erasure, absolutely. Yeah. Again, thanks at the back. Tyler.
I shouldn't be prioritized for my question. But I just wanted to say, when I was in my undergrad, I guess a few of you here in your undergrad, one of the most important books that I read was Imagined Communities by Benedict Anderson. And what I got from reading that book was that communities beyond sort of a really tight village scale, only exist if we imagine them. And we need to employ the kind of tools of media to be able to hold those communities within our imagination, and then to reconstruct them in the real world. I guess at this point I will interrupt my question with a plug. It's partially for that reason that I think it's imperative that we publish a book from this exhibition in order to encapsulate this particular memory that feeds that imagining of what this community has been and can imagine itself to be. And in that, my question is, how do you a lot of people have, the exhibition of these photos, I'm going to say a little bit more. The exhibition of these photographs is not just for the photographs themselves. The amount of people who've come in here and recognized themselves and then rekindled relationships and actually in the real reconstructed community amongst themselves has been amazing. The social function of this exhibition has been really mind-blowing. So I want to ask, how can exhibitions like these or what other types of strategies do you think should be employed to kind of cause us to imagine this part of Vancouver and to see if there is a community there that is to be imagined, and what sort of tools can we employ?
Can I just respond
Yeah,
to a few parts of that? I second your desire to have this exhibition live on when these photos come down from the wall. But what I've been thinking throughout is this is the beginning of a critically important oral history project, and if UBC Libraries is taking the archive, that has to be a component of what grows out of that, and generally a larger oral history project for this neighborhood history and communities that have made this what it is and the way in which it contributes to Vancouver. That seems essential, and why I said what I'd really like to do is to stay here and just hear your stories for each of these, whether you remember the moment that it happened or the stories that they trigger, the way in which these are a catalyst for that kind of memory. I think that's an important repository of the history that we want to preserve in our effort to disavow the tide of erasure that's so strong, I mean, literally and figuratively here. You're bringing Benedict Anderson into this room, I think, is brilliant. I distinctly remember reading that alone in my uncomfortable chair in my room in grad school, thinking, this is what he's talking about. There were all these people sitting alone in their uncomfortable chairs reading, and were very much really part of a community. Imagine, but that's a very real community, that imagined community that happens even when you're alone in a room. But the way you're describing it happening here is, it's happened, in fact, with everyone actually being in the same room, and the kind of productive energy that happens from that. So that relationship between imagined community from disparate places, now across time and geography and all these things, and community that builds up in these actual ways, I just think that Benedict Anderson is pulling us away from that lived way. We can still do that and do both. So what the Oral History Project and the book would do on the one hand, but in fact the ways in which we've created a community right here, right now, this afternoon, this is fleeting or ephemeral, but it matters, and it does a kind of work, and it will continue to resonate as we leave, and this grows exponentially in the ways in which we all talk about it and enact it and invoke it. So I just wanted to join you in welcoming Benedict Anderson into our imagined community here.
I also want to affirm then the need for this to turn into then this a durable form, not ephemeral. So a book publication, also the need, as Shelley has said, for an oral history to accompany these photographs. And I remember last week talking to Tyler, and Tyler then saying, well, if this digital collection could also be accompanied by Jim's voice-over commentary in some way, that then provides us with this resonant history. But I agree with the construction of an imagined community that would be evoked through our ability to see this in a book form, And that then creates even a wider conversation in terms of, though, of what could be seen as a sort of future outreach. I can see as well as when people come here and make those wonderful, amazing connections, and they have stories, there being a means then of collecting those stories as well. Yeah.
I just, before we finish, want to thank you for having me, Glenn and Chris and Tyler, and to thank you both and acknowledge what an honor it's been to be invited to participate with you. So thank you.
Do we have any other comments or questions from the audience? Oh, yes, we do. Okay, thank you.
I was just thinking, before the book is ready, something else can be done. A virtual space where, if Jim agrees to have the photographs there, and that makes it easier to facilitate some of the virtual communities discussion, because people seeing themselves or people they know on the web, they can immediately put a little post there. And so that could be the first step before the final book and the oral, complete oral project is done. Just a suggestion.
Yeah, I'd like to add the last word to
Yes,
this,
you can have it.
because, I mean, in the early days, that's what we did. What if? What if? And then you have to answer yourself, why not? And what we're trying to do is I'm trying to look into whether or not we can cultivate a new generation of activism, something that can create a greater future, a better vision. And if there's things that you see in the future you don't like, whether or not we have the capacity collectively to try to change it. And I think the new Asian Studies course is a very good beginning of this, because we need to really awaken. And this is, in the old days we talk about consciousness. You're either conscious or you're unconscious, So, and nowadays, it may be a different word, but this idea of consciousness, that once you're conscious and you're aware and you're self-aware, then if you like, you either create your own reality. And that's what I did. I wanted to be in Chinatown, so I created the reality of being in Chinatown. And, you make friends and you collect that, and that becomes your reality also. But you need to create a new reality so that a lot of other people can fit into it. And I'm really hopeful. And that's why Asian Canadian Writers Workshop, that's what we do. We don't charge people for helping them publish. All we ask them to do is that they, in turn, when their time comes, is they help somebody else. Mm. And that's the whole idea of community. We want people to understand and connect to, and to see themselves as part of a whole and part of a community.
It has been a great honor to moderate this panel. I'd like to, from the deepest part of my heart, thank Jim, and Jack, and Shelley for this amazing conversation, and also to thank you, our wonderful audience, this late afternoon. Thank you very much.